Good afternoon. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's new digital platform that will enable you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. With us today is Dr. Steve Bayme, AJC's Director of Contemporary Jewish Life, who has been with AJC since 1982 and is set to retire this July. This is part 1 of 4 of an oral history that Steve will be conducting over the course of the next several months. Today, Steve will present a sweeping overview of the modern-day history of Israel-Diaspora relations in this AJC Academy session. Steve will focus on how the question of relations between Israel and world Jewry erupted during the 1982 First Lebanon War, subsequently became critical over the 1988 Who is a Jew controversy, enjoyed an area of Israel diaspora warmth and mutual identification during the Oslo period, and became again a point of friction in the 21st century. The session will serve both to clarify ties and tensions between Israel and world Jewry and to understand AJC's evolution and journey in addressing those ties and tensions. After we hear from Steve, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions, that's questions plural, at ajc.org, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Steve, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Allie, and really best wishes to all of you up there. Obviously, these are very trying and difficult times, but let's hope that we get through it, number one, and number two, that we all stay in good health, and that we'll manage to get through this crisis. But thank you very much for joining. I'm really delighted that it was David Harris who first suggested we do this oral history series. Really, I'm delighted for 2 reasons. Number one is that institutional memory of how AJC handled certain things is very much a part of who we are today. The entire present is an outgrowth of the entire past. Second, it's a very good opportunity personally to reflect on my career at AJC, what has been accomplished in this area, and what are the enduring challenges that remain to be accomplished. The overall trajectory, as Ali indicated in her opening, is the evolution of AJC from a distinctively non-Zionist position, which was the rule of thumb. I heard the word frequently when I first joined AJC in 1982, that we were not a Zionist, we were not anti-Zionists, but we're not a Zionist organization. To where we are today, which is very much at the center of the pro-Israel community in the United States. Now, to be sure, again, technically speaking, AJC is still today not a Zionist organization. But it's fair to say that its lay leadership, its senior staff, most of the people in many ways associated with us in one way or another would proudly call themselves Zionists. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is present, number one, a bit of an overview as to how that evolution took place, what was its overall trajectory, and then talk about some of the challenges that we still continue to face. I'd like to begin really though with 4 crisis points in the relationship between Israel and world Jewry as they reflect themselves during my AJC career. The first, as Ali mentioned, was the issue of the Lebanon War. I joined AJC in May of 1982. Within a matter of weeks, the Lebanon War had erupted. Technically speaking, it was a reaction to a terrorist attack on the Israeli ambassador in London. He was severely wounded, affected him for the rest of his days. June 5th, 1982, Israel declared Operation Peace for Galilee, which essentially was targeted at protecting Jewish settlements in the north that have been under regular rocket attacks coming out of terrorist groupings coming in Lebanon. In retrospect, you can even say, was there really a Lebanon when there are about half a dozen different groupings, all of which laid claim to leadership within Lebanon? In many ways, the PLO there was a state within a state. While the technical motivation was spurred by this attack on the Israeli ambassador, in practice, because these terrorist attacks, these rocket attacks have been going on for quite some time on the Galilee, the plans for a retaliation against Lebanon had long been in the works. And in many ways, it was defined really as 2 plans. what might be called Little Pines, or what was called Little Pines, which was an attempt to safeguard the Galilee by creating a 40-kilometer, 25-mile zone on the Lebanese border that essentially were pushing the terrorist forces further away so they wouldn't be able to attack the Galilee. But then there was also the so-called Big Pines approach, which was that of eliminate the PLO from its domain within Lebanon. Very quickly, it became apparent that number one, the war would not be quick. It would be a long war. It lasted really for 3 months, June 6th to September 1st. And secondly, there'd be a great deal of dissent, both within Israel, certainly within Europe, and in general throughout the Jewish diaspora. Some argue that the press commentary regarding Israel was very intense, very negative during that period. Surprising to me, though, was precisely the level of dissent within AJC. Now, again, to be sure, the war invited that kind of dissent. In many ways, it was Israel's Vietnam, namely a long war that went on longer than anticipated, that the rationale for continuing to be there was not necessarily evident, and that Israel certainly was not winning that war. That said, what was most surprising is within a matter of weeks, 4 senior staff members of AJC signed an ad protesting the war in the New York Times. They said their identification with AJC was for identification purposes only, because reality was AJC as an organization had embraced Operation Peace for Galilee. This led to a strong debate, number one, about the role of staff, especially in the public domain. Number two, the positioning of AJC in terms of backing Operation Peace for Galilee, backing the Israeli government. One of the 4 staff members essentially were exercising, if you will, personal statements of opinion. What was questionable, of course, was that they were recognizable names precisely because they were affiliated with AJC. In other words, AJC had provided them with a perch by which to address the Jewish community, and certainly the New York Times was an incredibly effective perch. The debate lasted for quite some time, for about a year, as the propriety of their actions. There were those within AJC who did not sign the ad, but who felt that the ad was absolutely correct and that AJC had been wrong to be supportive of the Israeli government during the Lebanon War. Our Washington representative, legendary figure, Hyman Bookbinder, a year after the war said to us at a senior staff meeting, he said, the real legacy of Lebanon is, why did we not dissent? In other words, why did we back Operation Peace for Galilee instead of mounting a full-blown dissent against the Israeli actions? Another senior staff member, the head of our National Affairs Department, argued also at a senior staff seminar. He argued that AJC should be the peace party. In other words, it should be the party promoting negotiations towards peace, as opposed to be backing the Begin government, followed by the Shamir government, the Likud government, which in principle was arguing for no compromise on the West Bank. Others argued, to be sure, that at least the first part of the war, namely the 40-kilometer incursion into Lebanon to create sort of a safety zone away from the rockets, that in itself was legitimate. But the really important point was made by the then president of AJC, the late Maynard Wishner, wonderful raconteur. He was incredibly capable of commanding an audience with a fantastic sense of humor. But he told us at one of these meetings, he said, bear in mind that AJC is not going to go against the collective will of the Jewish community. That in that respect, while we are the leadership in the community, we're very much of the community. And he argued in that sense, it was not appropriate for AJC to be taking a position in direct public opposition to military action undertaken by the Israelis. Now, was this resolved? Was it, will it ever be resolved? Probably the turning point on this took place in about 8 years later, 9 years later, actually, 1991, over the controversy over loan guarantees to Israel. The loan guarantees issue essentially was that Israel was the beneficiary of Soviet Jewish immigration in large numbers, something Israel desperately wanted. And in that respect, David Harris, I'm sure, will speak about this in part 2 of his Soviet Jewry lecture series, that it was a great victory of Jewish foreign policy that Soviet Jews were free to emigrate. Reality is, of course, is that it takes millions of dollars to resettle immigrants into the state of Israel. Israel wanted loan guarantees from the United States government that would enable Israel to borrow at reduced rates on the international markets. So it was about $10 billion in loan guarantees that were at stake that would enable Israel to borrow at reduced costs. The first Bush administration, George Herbert Walker Bush, essentially made the argument that we'll give you the guarantees, but only if the monies are to be used not for resettling Soviet Jews or Soviet immigrants on the West Bank. That was only if they're resettled within Israel itself. Now, again, it spurred a great deal of discussion within AJC of which side do we take here? Do we support the Shamir government, which basically said, this is a humanitarian issue, not a political issue? Or do we support the Bush government, which basically said, we're willing to help you on humanitarian grounds. What we're not prepared to do is to help Israel in terms of settling the West Bank, therefore making, in effect, return of the West Bank or creation of a Palestinian state impossible. The debate took place for quite some time. It was resolved at an important board meeting of AJC in which David Harris made a very powerful pitch, one that I think continues to resonate to this day. David, at the time, was in his first year as executive director. It was unclear exactly which direction the agency was going to go. We'd been through a financial crunch precisely at that time. But he made a very important argument that this is not about who you or I may feel about West Bank settlements. Now, this is not simply a matter of opinion. This is a question of what is the responsible position for a leadership Jewish organization to take with clout in Washington, addressing the Congress and the administration. Seen in that context, it essentially was a statement of, I might agree with Bush that no, the money should not be used for the West Bank. But the question is, should a leadership organization be taking the position in support of the Israeli government, which David argued would be the responsible thing to do, or do we take a position that simply reflects our own sentiments? David's position prevailed, that what is the responsible thing for AJC to do is not to dissent from Israeli governmental policy on such a matter, but rather, regardless of how we may feel individually, the organization essentially argued for the loan guarantees. As I say, the discussion was critical because it meant a repositioning of the AJC, that yes, we knew that there was dissent within the organization. We knew many of the grounds for dissent might be quite legitimate, especially if you go back to the Lebanon War. It was Israel's Vietnam. It was not the right war in the right place at the right time. The question became, what is our position? What is our responsible thing for us to do as a leadership organization? Second major crisis was the issue of the Pollard affair of the 1980s. Jonathan J. Pollard, well known as to this day as, if you will, as a spy for the government of Israel within the United States Navy Department. Pollard was caught, arrested, put on trial, and many Israelis felt that American Jewry, and AJC specifically, abandoned Pollard for reasons of dual loyalty. In other words, that we felt that the charge against us was that we do not support Pollard because we feared that Pollard's existence as a spy for the government of Israel undermined our position as American Jews. This was an argument made by someone, a longtime mentor and professor of mine, Shlomo Avineri, once Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post saying, American Jews continue to suffer from the dual loyalty complex, that they're fearful the state of Israel exposes their loyalty as Americans. Now, reality was much more complex, and there were several things that went wrong in terms of the Pollard affair and Pollard's own actions that require owning up to. Number one is that Pollard himself did not admit he had made a mistake. An incredible statement, the evening before his sentencing, his then wife went on 60 Minutes and said, to sum it up, we regret nothing. In other words, no offer of contrition, no offer of acknowledgement of a mistake. Second, to this day, we're not fully aware of what the Casper-Weinberger memo was that resulted in Pollard receiving a life sentence. It's widely assumed, however, that what was inside the memo was that Pollard had given over the code book of the names of American agents in the field, in turn endangering their lives, and in turn endangering American security should that code book fall into the wrong hands. Thirdly, the well-known CNN journalist, Wolf Blitzer, then working for the Jerusalem Post, was granted full access to Pollard, something that no one really imagined, given the fact that he was engaged in security espionage. When Blitzer published the interview in a book that still is relevant today called Territory of Lies, again, it's assumed that the question was, would Pollard have the discretion of not telling things, or would he, in effect, spill his guts to an outside interviewer? When these things happened, the position of Pollard became much more tenuous in terms of American eyes. That said, surveys done at the time about American opinion regarding Pollard were remarkable. They said most people had never heard of Pollard. Of those who did, very few, if any, thought that Pollard was at all representative of the Jewish community. In other words, Pollard had his sins, if you will. American public opinion reacted quite favorably in saying, this is not the problem of the Jews, it's the problem of Pollard and the security establishment that gave him much too high a clearance. What I would say just in retrospect of it, though, is that as we look at Pollard, again, I think most people inside the American Jewish Committee feel that Pollard suffered inordinately. He was given a sentence that far exceeded that of given to other spies. However, bear in mind really two other footnotes here. Number one is that 9 different secretaries of defense, both Republicans and Democrats, all upheld Pollard's sentence over the ensuing decades. Second, Bibi Netanyahu as prime minister, in signing the Y agreement in 1997 about a somewhat of a partial retreat from Hebron, he asked for Pollard's release. At that time, the head of the CIA, George Tenet, wrote a letter to then President Clinton saying, if Pollard is released, we'll be faced with a massive resignation of CIA officers. That suggests, if you will, that Pollard's compromise of American security was quite serious, quite significant. Exactly how significant, we don't know. But my point is very simple, is that was AJC suffering from a dual loyalty complex? Without question, Pollard raised the anxieties of AJC leaders. But their opposition to advocating for Pollard's release was rooted in the fact that the crimes that Pollard had committed, for which he was convicted in a court of law, those crimes in many ways were far more serious, or were as serious as was alleged. Let me put it this way, again, in retrospect, the sentence Pollard received was, I would say, was excessive. Certainly by the time he was released in 2015, he still has not been completely released. Any data that he had was no longer relevant. It was clearly been outrun by events. What's fair to say is when American Jews, and AJC specifically, did not mount a defense of Pollard, what they were reflecting was a sense that Pollard's crimes really had been significant, and much less the dual loyalty charge, which was leveled at AJC by people like the very otherwise highly revered Shlomo Avineri. Thirdly, the Who is a Jew controversy of 1988. Very complicated, but roughly speaking, from day one, and surprisingly, the Orthodox parties had never enjoyed a monopoly over conversion to Judaism. They're perceived as enjoying monopoly, but in reality, that they have a monopoly over marriage. They do not have a monopoly over conversion. What they saw as missing in the law of return. The law of return is a very liberal law. It allows many non-Jewish groupings to come into Israel, especially first-degree family members, even in the 3rd generation, can come into Israel under the law of return and get immediate citizenship. So the law of return is hardly an exclusive piece of legislation. It's highly inclusive. The Who is a Jew clause for the law of return reads that anyone is a Jew who is a child of a Jewish mother or a convert to Judaism. The religious parties never thought that as being adequate because it did not specify what kind of conversion. So they wanted to amend the Who is a Jew clause to say specifically a convert to Judaism in accordance with Jewish law, which in turn would mean in accordance with Orthodox Jewish law, granting in effect an Orthodox monopoly where it did not exist. This proposed legislation had a real chance of passing because the 1988 elections resulted in increased mandates for all the religious parties, especially the ultra-Orthodox ones. There was a lot of cheering in the streets of Mea Shearim and other ultra-Orthodox areas. The American Jewish community was appalled by it because you can think in practical terms that essentially it was not only delegitimating converts, it was also delegitimating the reform and conservative movements who were doing most of the conversions inside the United States. They would not be directly affected, they'd be symbolically affected. The only ones directly affected would be those who actually be moving to Israel and claiming the benefits of the law of return, which they would have gotten because they were first-degree family members. But symbolically, they would be excluded from the law, from the Who is a Jew clause. So AJC joined a large coalition of conservative reform leadership in protesting this proposed legislation. Short term, it worked very, very well. We actually did Prime Minister Shamir a favor that he didn't want to enter into a coalition with the religious parties. He felt it would be too confining. It brought about a national unity coalition together with labor, and the religious parties suddenly found that they were irrelevant to the coalition forming process. Long term, the issue I think is more problematical. That while AJC joined this coalition, we essentially acted in a defense mode, namely that we prevented restrictive legislation from being passed. What we did not come up with was an alternative to solve the problem. There were solutions in the air. The one that was particularly popular in some AJC circles was usually referred to as polydoxy of teaching, orthopraxy of conversion, which meant in effect a compromise. Conversion institutes would be set up that would be Orthodox, conservative, reform, pluralistic in their teaching. The actual practice would be affirmed by the chief rabbinate. That was the compromise that was suggested. AJC did not push it, and mainly because we could not agree on this compromise that, well, doesn't that mean that the reform and conservative movements don't have equal status when it came to the actual practice of conversion? No, it didn't. It was a compromise that probably would have satisfied neither side, but it was a real compromise. Ultimately, it was rejected. The issue remains unresolved, and it continues to flare up down into 2020. The last crisis is the one that's with us right now, and that is the issue of the distancing of young people from Israel. In some measure, and perhaps in large measure, that's a function of Israeli public policy, namely that policies adopted by the state of Israel on issues of religious pluralism and identity, without question, favor the Orthodox grouping. And number two, Israeli policy, certainly over the last 10 years, you have a very controversial prime minister. It's critiqued by many on the grounds that it has not been serious in the quest for peace. While I don't reject those arguments completely, I do say there's a larger context here, and that is at the very root of the chasm between younger American Jews and the state of Israel is the issue of assimilation, meaning the more distant one is from Jewish matters generally, the more distant one is from the state of Israel. So in that respect, as assimilation has grown, which it clearly has, the intermarriage rate right now is 58% and 71% if you weed out the Orthodox, if you don't count the Orthodox who lower the intermarriage rate. So with the growth of mixed marriage and assimilation, there'll be a growth in the chasm between Israel and American Jewry. Or better yet, if Israel did everything American Jews would like her to do on issues of West Bank settlements, religious pluralism, support for a peace process, if Israel did all of that, we would still have the problem of distancing because none of it addresses the issue of assimilation. So what does all this mean? And this really is my final concluding point that we'll open up for comments, questions, criticisms. But in terms of where we are today, of Israel diaspora distancing, we need to adopt much more limited objectives, but realistic objectives. We need to, number one, educate American Jews about the realities of Israel. We tend to know Israel primarily through the headlines and the front pages of the media. We don't know Israeli society. We don't know the reality of what it means to serve in the army, and it's experience that largely is foreign to American Jews today. We don't understand the nuances of religious pluralism in Israel. What are the conservative reform movements? What impact they actually have? Who are the Haredim? What is their agenda? Are they only trying to accomplish a monopoly over conversion, or do they have more pressing issues like employment, job training, picking up some skills? All these things are in our hands of how we educate American Jews. Conversely, we need to raise the consciousness of Israeli society of education about the diaspora. If we really believe in one Jewish people, then the study of the Jewish experience is much larger than the history of the modern Israel. The diaspora is often channeled or transmitted as a story of anti-Semitism and assimilation. Those narratives are critical, and they're important. We can't afford to ignore them, let alone become complacent about them. But they're hardly the narrative of the diaspora Jewish experience, which is a much richer narrative of diversity, creativity, leadership rising to the occasion, and the multitude of occasions where the existence of Israel has been enormously strengthened by a strong, vital diaspora. So with that, let me conclude the overview. And Ali, I'll turn it back to you in terms of comments, questions, criticisms.
Thank you so much, Steve. I just want to remind our listeners that you can submit questions for Steve by emailing questions, that's questions plural, at ajc.org, or by using the Q&A feature in Zoom. Steve, our first question comes from a member in Chicago, and their question is, you mentioned the need to educate American Jews about Israel. Haven't major Jewish organizations like AJC and Jewish institutions like Brandeis University been trying to do that for years? What explains the shortcomings and the lack of knowledge that you mentioned?
Well, great question. First of all, one of the things I take pride in terms of my tenure at AJC is together with Brandeis, back in 2004, we launched a program to train college professors across the country, and since then it's grown globally, to introduce and teach courses on modern Israel at their respective universities. After 15 years, we've hit 300 college professors at over 200 different universities across the globe. Now, they're all teaching courses at their respective institutions. They come in all different shapes and sizes. When I returned from the first one back in 2004, my chairman at the time was Dr. Harold Shapiro, past president of Princeton, one of the most wonderful people I've worked with at AJC. He asked me how it went, and I said, well, these professors come in all different shapes and sizes. Some are very good, some seem to be adequate, and some you wonder how they ever got tenure. So in that respect, you can't assume this uniformity of teaching or uniformity of quality of teaching. What is fair to say is that the introduction of these courses into their campuses enhances the imagery and importance of Israel in the consciousness of college students. That said, the reason the program was introduced, number one, is that there were very few courses on modern Israel at universities around the country. Number two, when we speak to American Jews today and ask what is the knowledge of it regarding Israel, unfortunately, it turns out to be painfully low, abysmally low. Do we understand Israeli politics? We did a survey a number of years ago asking the question, true or false, are Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres members of the same political party? 2/3 answered that was true when they are bitter political rivals and enemies. And that was not during the period of the National Unity Government. It's when they really were the opposition. So the level of literacy regarding Israel is quite low. But I go on to that a further step and say it's also a matter of understanding Israeli society and how it differs from the American Jewish experience. We live in the greatest society in diaspora Jewish history. We do not have to deal with the day-to-day threats that are existential in nature of a ton of people who say you should not be in existence. That results in a very different model of society in which security concerns do become paramount. Service in the army becomes a requirement as opposed to a voluntary matter. Israel, for that matter, has actually never known a volunteer sector. The way we have, we built a network here in the States, a volunteer network that is the pride and joy of the American Jewish community. So when I say, do we understand one another, the level of difference of language, religion, politics, and culture is enormous. When I talk about an Israel education program for American Jews, it's a matter of transmitting that understanding of Israel beyond factual accuracy. So we'll know, no, Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir were not political allies, they were political rivals. Let's go beyond the factual aspect of it to understand questions of why did Oslo fail? What's the nature of Israeli democracy? Israeli treatment of minorities? And all those questions that often come up in terms of cocktail conversation of what is Israel as a Jewish state? What does that mean? We need to enrich our people much more seriously and much more in depth.
Thank you so much, Steve. We have a lot of great questions coming in, and a few questions are along the same lines, and a few people are wondering if you can elaborate on the current divide between Israelis becoming, in many senses, more politically conservative and American Jews remaining quite liberal.
Great question, Ali. Also, this divide did not begin yesterday. For American Jews, it's often seen as their civic religion is American liberalism. The joke on this was a number of years ago at the National Conference of the Jewish Federations of North America. It's known as the General Assembly. So one speaker is alleged, I'm sure this is apocryphal, but it says, speaks volumes, got up and said, how do we say tikkun olam in Hebrew? You know, in other words, that our core values, our core religion is the liberal consensus of American Jews. And that's been our political stance, accepting the Orthodox community, but it's been our political stance for a good number of decades. In the last several decades, but in general, since the 67 Six-Day War, Israel has been moving rightward. American Jews have retained the liberal consensus. Among the younger generation, they've become perhaps more so. So when people speak of the bromance between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Donald Trump, and see that as the most recent expression of this divide, this political divide between us, it didn't start yesterday. It did not start with Bibi Netanyahu, and it did not start with Donald Trump. It really started on the basis that Israel pre-67 was very much aligned with the liberal ideals of the United States and of American Jewry. If anything, it was even more aligned because Israel shared socialist ideals, where our civic religion here is very much one of capitalist type liberalism or neoliberalism. Since 67, Israel has gradually, slowly but surely moved to the right, and that's been expressed in the fact that in the last 53 years, the Labour Party has governed for, I believe, about 7 or 8 years out of the last 53. The rest of the time it's been governed by the Likud, and for a brief period of time, the so-called Kadima Party. Look at Israeli politics today, the Labour Party is a shadow of its former self. So Israel has moved politically rightward, while for American Jews, the one thing is predictable is that American Jews will vote for the more liberal candidate for American politics, provided that candidate is not understood as being hostile to Israel. So in that sense, the ties between American Jews and Israel are still strong, in the sense we rejected President Carter in 1980 because he was seen as not being friendly to Israel, certainly upped the pressure on Israel considerably, even though he was clearly the more liberal candidate in the 1980 presidential election. So the ties remain strong, but the overall drift of American Jewish politics has been leftward, while the overall drift of Israeli politics has been rightward. And that's why one of the reasons underlying the chasm between the world's two largest Jewish communities.
Thank you so much, Steve. Our next question comes from Alan Edelman, and I'm receiving lots of questions along similar lines. You spoke of what American Jews need to learn about Israel. What do Israelis, especially Israeli leaders, need to learn about American Jewry?
Well, first of all, the position of the reform and conservative movements in the United States, their position obviously is challenged by assimilation. but they still represent the overwhelming majority of American Jews. In other words, they face internal challenges of Jewish continuity. And Jewish continuity is at the very heart of the issue of Israeli-diaspora relations. But when Israeli political leaders, the chief rabbi is certainly the most notorious of them, but by the same token, it often extends to more secular leaders. When they say the conservative reform movements are doomed to disappear, they're taking the data of assimilation and projecting it as fixed and determined, as fixed and concrete. And therefore, it must be this way. And therefore, they draw the conclusion, well, these movements have no future anyway. Why should we bother investing in them? That's flawed on two major grounds. Number one, it simply is the denial of Jewish peoplehood. Whatever you think of the future of those two movements, they represent core dimensions of how we define the Jewish people today. So in that respect, in principle, it's the wrong approach. But second, I think more importantly, is that it totally misses the critical significance of the liberal religious movements for American-Israeli relations. Namely that American Jews found within the liberal movements are key backers of the US-Israel special relationship. You dismiss those movements, you say they're not relevant. We should invest only in the Orthodox because we know that they're going to be tied to Israel, is ultimately undermining Israeli national security. Now, we've raised this point at numerous points within the last few years, particularly with the Jewish Religious Equality Coalition that was established by Dov Zakheim and myself about 5 years ago. I have to say after 5 years that we've made the point over and over and over again, and no one disputes it. But we have not moved the needle in terms of the treatment of the liberal religious movements. So that's one area where Israeli leaders need much more education about the diversity of American Jews. What do you mean by conservative Reform Judaism? What is the distinctness between those two movements? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their challenges? How can Israel help with some of the challenges rather than dismissing them? So that certainly to me is one critical arena. The second is understanding what is the role of American Jewry today in terms of world Jewish politics. Oftentimes Israeli political leaders think, well, American Jews are less than 2% of the population in the United States. Therefore, again, do they really make a difference in terms of US-Israel relations? How can less than 2% of the population have much of an impact? Yeah, we are less than 2% of the population. To be precise, we're at 1.8%. But if you realize that we are 1/3 of the religious influence in this country, that speaks volumes. When you realize that so much of the political discourse in American politics is articulated by Jewish intellectuals, Jewish writers, Jewish editors, magazines. In other words, the political culture of America is one in which Jews play an enormous role. Therefore, not to understand and appreciate the influence of American Jews, politically, culturally, intellectually, again, is not only hurtful of the concept of peoplehood, of who we are as one people, it's also hurtful of Israeli national security. So those are two broad strokes. I think there's much more to be said about American Jewish identity, the diversity within it. It's not a question here in America of being Orthodox and being assimilated. There are a lot of different options, a lot of different varieties. Some, without question, work better than others. But to me, if one believes that, if one upholds the standard of Jewish peoplehood, it means that the critical beacon of Jewish peoplehood, namely the return of the Jews to sovereignty and statehood in a homeland of their own, its obligation is to be strengthening the diaspora, as opposed to thinking in terms of an end to the diaspora, or withering away of the diaspora. It's fair to say classical Zionist theory was always that of the Jews who want to be Jewish will move to a Jewish state. And that was Herzl. And the rest will be then free to assimilate. History has not worked that way. That the vitality of diaspora Jewry, again, notwithstanding the Holocaust, which dealt an incredible blow to the diaspora Jewish experience, but we've seen diaspora Jewry is much more resilient than classical Zionist theory allowed for. And what I'd say is later Zionist theory has argued much more for a symbiotic relationship between Israel and the diaspora, as opposed to a relationship in which Israel is the center and the diaspora is the periphery. I would, without question, still see a priority being given to the notion of homeland, which is not the case in the diaspora. But that said, I'd say we have strong communities. We need to strengthen one another.
Thank you, Steve. We have a question from St. Louis, and the caller wants to know, the tension between Israel and American Jews seems to be very strong. But in other diaspora communities, such as communities in Europe and Latin America, the communities feel a much closer bond to Israel. Can you explain why that is?
Right, great points. But there are two major explanations. Number one is that, first of all, we're a lot larger here than any other diaspora. We have a lot more voices. So in a free society, you're going to hear all sorts of voices. Some of them you agree with, some of them you won't agree with. But I think more to the point is, and this is something American Jews often lose sight of, is that the United States remains and has been Israel's strongest friend and ally. The overall political culture in America is overwhelmingly pro-Israel by 4-1 and 5-1 margins. Again, in our Jewish mindset, we always accentuate the negatives. So we see something going wrong, say on the college campus, and we say that's normative. No, when something goes wrong, something's going wrong. But American political culture remains overwhelmingly sympathetic to Israel. In that context, American Jews feel much more at liberty to be critical of Israel. Compare that with France. And here, I recently spoke on this with our representative in Paris. She wrote to me that without question, in a society in which Israel is under a great deal of attack, people are going to rally around the Israeli flag. That is not to say that they don't have all the same issues of West Bank settlements, Israeli peace policies, Israeli incursions into Gaza. They may have all the same questions that we have here in the States, but they're far more restrained about voicing them because they live in a society in which Israel is under daily intellectual attack in the media and in French public culture. So in that respect, I think we need to understand a step about ourselves. Look, I said earlier that we never really solved the problem of dissent, except that we said AJC as a leadership organization feels its primary responsibility is to be supportive of Israel. That's what we're about, in which case sometimes the issues on which we might otherwise dissent, we put to the side a second and say, what are we really about? Reality is, on 2 occasions, we invited Peter Beinart, who probably has become the poster boy for American Jewish dissent. I invited him personally because I had the strongest personal relationship with him to address, number one, the board of governors of AJC, and then the global forum, which obviously the latter was clearly a prime space, where it's our single most public showcase. We offered a podium, platform to what I consider to be one of the leading dissenters from Israeli public policy. He gave his speech. We did not agree with him, and we made it clear we didn't agree with him. I was the closer for that debate. Subsequently, he wrote a piece lambasting us as not really being a truly open organization. There was a perfect example where we actually opened up our doors, to public expression of dissent, rather than win over the people who feel that we don't dissent enough, or we don't offer enough space for dissent. The payback, if you will, was much more a sense of, well, AJC is a much more conservative organization. It marches in lockstep with the Israeli government. Whatever Israel does, AJC will be quick to echo. None of that has historically been true because, as I said, there are issues on which we really have parted company, especially religious pluralism. But the issue of having public discussion of these issues, we're open to that discussion. The question is, policy-wise, what is our actual stance? And in Washington, our voice is much more that of being supportive. So my long answer to the question is that there is a great deal of dissent here in the United States because America remains very much of a pro-Israel culture, and Jews feel much more at liberty to speak for themselves and express themselves. In other diasporas, where the attacks upon Israel have been much more intense, the tendency has been much more to rally around the Israeli flag within the Jewish community.
Great. Steve, we have a question from Russell Schwartz of Los Angeles. And Russell wants you to expound a little bit more on the conversion issue in Israel. If the rabbinate gets full control of recognizing conversions, do you think the people who had non-Orthodox conversions before will no longer be considered Jews in the state of Israel, or would the new rules only apply to conversions after rules take effect?
Yeah, historians are very good at reconstructing the past. We don't have a great track record when it comes to predicting the future. So, look, in some respects, all bets are off. In principle, there has always been the theory that you can't annul a conversion retroactively. So, in that respect, were that to take place, the so-called worst-case scenario, I have strong doubts that the chief rabbinate would act that way. What is entirely possible, I may be wrong because I'm speculating, but I think what's entirely possible is that the chief rabbinate does not want to retroactively annul conversions. What it wants to do is to say all conversions that are done outside the parameters of the chief rabbinate should be considered illegitimate. Now, here it's a complicated issue, but it's an important dimension of the history of Jewish law. There have always been in Jewish law two approaches to conversion. One is that of someone converts only when they become fully observant. That's what the chief rabbinate would like. There's always been a second opinion that basically says, accept the major principles and let the rest follow in time. In other words, do the conversion fairly quickly if they accept the major principles, and then we'll deal with the actual degree of observance at a later point. That second principle is a much more inclusive approach to conversion, rather than the much more restrictive approach the chief rabbinate wants. The chief rabbinate has been speaking out on this because liberal Orthodox rabbis in Israel have been arguing for the second minority position. It's a minority position, doesn't mean it's a less authentic position. Key among them has been Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, originally of New York City, who has developed this entire program called Conversion in Accordance with Jewish Law, meaning that we want a liberal, inclusive conversion, which means acceptance of major principles, rather than full observance. Now, there's a lot of debate and criticism over this. The issue is whether the Knesset, the legislative process, can be used to certify an Orthodox monopoly when you have, if you will, other forms of conversion that are out there. What I think if the chief rabbinate had its way, that's where they would go. They would say, looking forward, all conversions, we won't annul anything retroactively. Although again, there have been those who have argued for that, so I can't eliminate that possibility entirely. But more likely they'll say, looking towards the future, from here on in, all conversions must go through the chief rabbinate. Personally, I'd like to think, and again, I may be wrong, but I think I've heard this from prominent Israelis, including at the Israel Democracy Institute, which is probably one of the leading liberal think tanks in Israel, that the chief rabbinate has taken an awful lot of hits on this. The ultra-Orthodox parties do not want increasing restrictive legislation. What they want is a better lifestyle for their constituents. That means things like job training, education, skills, what in broader terms might be called greater integration. The leaders, the religious leaders of the ultra-Orthodox oppose that tooth and nail. It means the loss of their control. But in many ways, the level of proposed religious legislation, I personally think, is not going to be nearly as intense as we might imagine it might be, because they're concerned much more with their own internal situation. I say that with a great deal of speculation. I've been wrong before, I'm wrong again, but I hope I'm right on this one.
Steve, we'll take our last question now from Michael Lustig of New York. And this is a pretty relevant question considering today's political news in Israel. But will a new unity government be able to make progress in limiting the power of the rabbinate, reducing subsidies for those who are learning full-time, forcing more participation in army and national service? And could that incentivize Haredim to be more participatory in society and the Israeli economy?
Okay, two quick responses on that. History here actually is somewhat of a guide. Every time we've had a national unity government, which in theory means it could do a great deal without the religious parties, it doesn't really happen because they're always worried about what's going to happen in the next election. In other words, any coalition government is only as strong as it can stand on its own 2 feet and say, we're not worried about what's going to happen when the coalition falls apart. That's not been the historical experience. It's often also true that a new government can annul earlier legislation. There was legislation back in 2013 in terms of a conscription into the army. Then, what happened after that was the next government basically said, no further, we're annulling that. We're going to have the so-called Tull Law, which annulled the, Tull Law was for conscription. It was annulled by a later government. So this historical guidance that we have here is not terribly encouraging, that in principle, a national unity government could accomplish enormous amounts in terms of some of these issues. In practice, it hasn't always worked out that way. That's one aspect of it. The second, though, is that, and this perhaps you might say is more, is more on the, to be more sanguine about it, is that a national unity government, there is very little difference between the parties on matters of national security. In that respect, if you're looking for major new departures in terms of Israeli foreign policy, I tend to doubt that, because there really isn't all that much difference between blue and white and Likud on those issues. Where there is probably much greater divide is that the Likud government under Bibi Netanyahu has been incredibly protective of the religious parties. Blue and white wants to see itself much more as moderate. The head of Blue and White, Benny Gantz, is actually a product of a religious family, but he does not want to spread or enhance greater religious control. Religion should be a matter of freedom of choice and not a matter of legislation and governmental activity. This is a view that many in the National Religious Party actually articulated many years ago, and they did not prevail. They wanted to see religion as much more as the conscience of the state, as the critic of state policy, rather than as a legislative organ that can actually force people to come to abide by the rules. Among them, I'd say, was very important French political theorist Alexis de Tocqueville. Back in the 1830s, he argued that religion in America works because of separation of church and state. That it means the religion becomes independent of the state and then can serve as the moral conscience of the state. What has been devastating to religion in Israel is that it's never been independent of the state. It's been hopelessly intertwined between politics and religious concerns. Ali, do we have time for anything? I've gotten a couple of messages on the screen as I've been talking.
We're actually out of time. So Steve, I want to thank you for that fascinating session. I want to also thank our AJC community for joining us today. Part 2 of 4 of Steve's oral history will be on AJC's history as a Jewish organization and will be next month. Additional details will be forthcoming. In addition, AJC is encouraging and highlighting acts of kindness during this current crisis as part of its newly launched Be a Mensch campaign. Visit ajc.org/Be a Mensch, that's BEAMENSCH, to submit your own story of menschy behavior or share it on social media using the hashtag #BeAMensch. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.